Shifting climate would play a part in the spread of the Black Death and the social upheavals that led to the American and French revolutions. Researchers from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution find evidence of past climate change by extracting sediment cores from the ocean floor. They have discovered intriguing information concerning the Little Ice Age.
The seafloor is a repository for shells of animals that grew in the overlying waters and for sediments that wash off land. And these layers accumulate in the cores, and we get a record that might be 100,000 or even 1,000,000 years long.
Samples of the mud reveal a snapshot of the past climate record, including extreme changes such as the Little Ice Age.
We have records of sea surface temperature, of deep ocean temperature, of salinity. We have records of volcanism, solar activity. There's countless things that can be measured here.
The samples are then radiocarbon dated in a particle accelerator.
Radiocarbon dating is a tool that allows us to tie together climate records and changes in the Earth system from sediment cores and link those to the historical record as far back as 40,000 years.
So we've dated the bottom of the core at about 1,700 years before present. And at that time, this was the seafloor. So sediment is continually accumulating 1,700 years, 1,500 years, 1,000 years, 500 years ago here, about the beginning of the Little Ice Age, right up to today. And, you know, if you go back in 100 years from now, there'll probably be a few more centimeters of sediment accumulated at this location.
The subtle difference in the color of the mud indicates microscopic particles pointing to a change in ocean currents during the Little Ice Age. This evidence from the ocean itself corroborates a 1/2 to a 3-degree drop in average temperature. This difference in temperature, although small, was nevertheless significant enough to be the catalyst for a shattering climate disaster that changed the course of history and left millions of people dead. Some scientists predict that a sudden violent change in climate might lead to a big chill. If they're right, freezing temperatures will grip Europe and the northeastern coast of the United States. Life will come to a standstill in a frozen wasteland. It has happened before. Generations of people had prospered in the stable climatic conditions that characterized pre-Renaissance Europe. But in the 1300s, and without warning, the world was turned upside down during the so-called Little Ice Age.
One of the things that happened was that you had this whipsaw, going to warm, going to cold. 1309 was cold, 1315 was warm, 1317 was cold again. And creatures and other things respond in different ways. You know, you get crops rotting in the field if it gets too wet, or germinating too early, or never germinating at all.
The climate swung back and forth between cold and warm, wet and dry. But these initial erratic weather conditions were only a prelude to the disastrous changes of epic proportions that followed. Over the next centuries, the weather continually fluctuated between 0.5 and 3 degrees lower than normal. This small change was enough to provoke a cataclysm.
Throughout the Alps and throughout parts of Europe, and in fact in North America, in Canada, the eastern Canadian Arctic, we see evidence that during the Little Ice Age, glaciers advanced.
The difference of only a few degrees triggered a self-perpetuating feedback cycle.
You make a little more ice, it reflects more of the sun. By reflecting the sun is not warming us up, and so it gets colder, so you make more ice.
As the glaciers expanded, the Vikings took the first brunt of the chill.
They switched from being a farming economy to eating a lot from the sea because they were having troubles raising enough things on their farms, apparently.
But as temperatures continued to drop, Storms and icy gales blasted the settlements. Even the sea no longer held hope of survival for the starving Vikings.
Around Iceland, sea ice expanded, and the people couldn't get out and go fishing, and they had open boats, not boats with decks, so they were particularly vulnerable to bad weather.
After many years of expansion and prosperity, the brave, ferocious Vikings were defeated by a sudden drop in temperature.
Well, 10 super cold years, including one of the coldest years on record ever in about 1355 AD, shut down the western colony, and 100 years later, the more southerly eastern colony shut down.
The Vikings who survived migrated south, assimilating into the races of continental Europe. Their heroic culture receded into legend. If it hadn't been for the Little Ice Age, the Vikings may have continued to explore and settle the New World, and America would have developed very differently. By the end of the 14th century, Europe was buckling under below-zero temperatures all winter long. In a chain reaction set off by the cold and stormy weather, one calamity followed another. Crops failed, and food shortages spread across the continent. The freezing cold blasted through Asia. That was only the beginning. Relentless storms killed at least 7 million souls. The resulting floods produced a horrific blowback effect on Europe.
Everybody's familiar with the Black Death, but the lesser-known story, of course, is the role that climate may have played in unleashing it.
The plague, known as the Black Death, was a pandemic that ravaged Europe during the mid-14th century. The drop in temperature changed the weather, causing storm patterns to shift and intensify. In the early 1300s, Asia suffered an unprecedented series of torrential storms and subsequent floods. Rats carrying the plague thrived in these conditions.
The animals that react the first are the ones that reproduce by the zillions and reproduce very rapidly, whereas the longer-lived, slower reproducing animals tend to lag, and so weedy species of every sort seem to take advantage of climate change and flourish.
Rats on ships traveling the trade routes spread the disease from Asia to Europe. An already starving and weakened population was ill-prepared to meet the Black Death. Within 5 years, the plague killed between 25 and 34 million people in Europe, 1/3 of the population. An estimated 40 million more died in northern Africa and Asia. Generation after generation had to endure the relentless pounding of extreme cold and drenching rain. The average starving peasant was pushed far beyond his limits.
Then there are intense storms and incessant rain. Crops are rotting in the field. There's so little sunlight that he can't make salt in the summer to preserve anything. Diseases, molds, blights, and everything else are beginning to afflict him. People fell into robbery, they lost their lands, starvation, they started eating their livestock, dogs and cats, and at some points they even ate each other.
Sophisticated European societies quickly crumbled, their citizens scratching at the edges of mere survival. Starving peasants revolted against the aristocracy. Political unrest and economic crisis in England were determining factors in the American Revolution. And it was the poor of France that stormed the Bastille in the French Revolution of 1789. The tragic scale of the Little Ice Age was staggering. Millions died horrible deaths simply because the temperature dropped a few degrees.
If you're living on the edge, and you get just a little bit of a cooling, it can push you over the edge.
Little changes in global temperatures can have an enormous effect. A temperature change of 5 to 9 degrees, which is also within the realm of possibility, would just be